everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new Mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week, so if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we are going to be talking about a big case, a case that I'm sure a few of you have been anticipating because I've mentioned covering it a few times recently. Today we are talking about the infamous case of the Hillside Stranglers, the serial killer cousins Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi. They were responsible for the disappearances and murders of several young women in the late 70s, but it would be one of the killers' arrogant nature that would eventually lead to their downfall, that would lead to them being identified. But quickly before we get into the case, I would like to say a special thank you to HelloFresh for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. If you are a regular viewer of this channel, you will know that I've worked with HelloFresh many times now. They are a brand that I absolutely adore. But for those of you who are not familiar with HelloFresh, they are a meal kit delivery service and they offer so many different recipes every single week which can be delivered straight to your door. You can choose from 55 plus weekly options and discover seasonal recipes. Right now, because we are currently in summer, HelloFresh has a Taste of Summer series which include recipes like cheese stuffed burgers, grilled salmon with balsamic tomatoes, and so many more perfect to enjoy this time of year. HelloFresh also offers veggie meal kits. They have meal kits for pescatarians and also fit and wholesome meals which make it easier than ever for you to stick to your goals and eat well without having to sacrifice flavor. With HelloFresh, you can save so much. You're saving so much time because you don't have to make a trip to the supermarket. You don't have to spend ages trying to work out exactly what you need and how you actually make the meal that you are going to cook. Every single thing that you need to make your HelloFresh recipes are in the box, all of the pre-portioned ingredients and also the step-by-step instructions. And because the ingredients are pre-portioned, you're also saving money that might have otherwise been spent on perhaps excess food, so there is a lot less food waste as well. And HelloFresh can help you eat more sustainably too. They are actually the first carbon neutral meal kit company and nearly all of their packaging is recyclable. So if you would like to give HelloFresh a try, then I have an incredible deal which you can use. If you go to hellofresh.com and use the code MOLLY16, you can get up to 16 free meals and 3 surprise gifts. Once again, a huge thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you to you guys for always supporting the sponsors on this channel. And now let's just get into the case. So for this week's case, we are going back to the late 70s in Los Angeles, which is obviously in California in the US. But actually, before we get into the murder spree, we are going to first delve into the background of our two killers, starting with the older of the two men, Angelo Buono. So Angelo Anthony Buono Jr. was born on the 5th of October 1934 in Rochester in New York into an Italian-American family. His mother was named Jenny, and I couldn't find the name of his father, but his father wasn't really in his life anyway. As I understand it, his parents separated when he was still quite young. Angelo was one of 2 children. He had a sister named Cecilia, and following their parents' separation in 1939, so when Angelo was around 5 years old, the family of 3 relocated to the city of Glendale in LA. Angelo Buono was always a very troublesome child. He was never well behaved, he never really followed any rules, and from a very young age, Angelo seemed to develop a disdain, a hatred for women, and this appears to have started with his mother Jenny. He never really had a very good relationship with his mother at all. He thought very, very little of her, and when he was a teenager, he used to call her horrible names. He called her a whore because apparently his mother would often go and see 3 different men, and she would take her son with her and he would just have to wait outside. He had zero respect for his mother and other women too. He believed that women should act and behave a certain way. He believed that women should effectively know their place. But equally, he fancied himself as a bit of a ladies' man. As an adult, he was that kind of gross, arrogant man that thought every single woman fancied him and was attracted to him. He treated them awfully throughout his entire life. Pretty much every woman that he ever knew or came across, he was awful to. Even when he was in school, in high school, he actually used to brag to his peers and his friends about all of the girls that he had raped. To him, that was something to be proud of. According to sources, when Buono was a teenager, he was completely and utterly obsessed with a man named Carol Chessman, who was a serial rapist. Chessman operated in Los Angeles and he was sentenced to death for his crimes. He was executed in 1960. But when Buono heard about him and his crimes, he became his idol. He sickeningly looked up to him and aspired to be like him, to be like this rapist. When Angelo Buono was 16 years old, he left education. He dropped out of school and he began what would become a life of crime. He would commit theft, he would steal cars and joyride, he got himself involved in gang activity, and by 17 years old, he was in youth custody after being arrested for car theft. In his adulthood, Angelo Buono married several times. He married his first wife when he was around 20 years old and she was 17, although they didn't stay together for very long. They quickly got a divorce, and he married a further 3 women over the years whom he had a number of children with. I believe he fathered 8 children in total. However, he also got a divorce from these wives too. None of his marriages ever worked out. I imagine probably because he treated his wives awfully. He was incredibly violent towards them. He was both physically and sexually abusive towards his partners and also his children. It's actually stated on a couple of sources that he raped his own kids, his own daughters. Around 1975, Angelo Buono started working as a car upholsterer, and he actually started his own auto upholstery business. He opened his own car upholstery shop, which was located in Glendale in California, and his business actually did really well. He was making good money from it. He had a lot of customers. It was a success. And then just the following year, in early 1976, life for Angelo Buono was turned completely upside down when he agreed to let one of his cousins, 25-year-old Kenneth Bianchi, move in with him. Now, Angelo wasn't too happy about this, about letting Bianchi stay with him. There was a big age difference between them. As I said, by this point, Kenneth Bianchi was 25 and Buono was around 42. There was about 17 years between them, and also Buono had become used to living on his own and he liked it. He didn't really want another person staying with him, but he begrudgingly accepted. He was doing a favour for the family, and so Kenneth moved in. Little did the family know that the union of these 2 men would eventually lead to one of the most brutal and horrific killing sprees that the US had ever seen and would ever see. But now that we've talked about Angelo Buono's background, let's talk a bit more about his cousins, Kenneth Bianchi. Kenneth Alessio Bianchi was born on the 22nd of May 1951, also in Rochester in New York. Now, as I understand it, Bianchi never really knew his biological parents. His mother worked as a sex worker, and when Kenneth was born, she didn't feel as though she was able to take care of him, and so she put him up for adoption. And just a couple of months after he was born, he was adopted by a couple, Nicholas and Frances Bianchi, who had no other children. Now, Frances was Angelo Buono's aunt. She was Angelo's mother's sister, making Angelo and Kenneth cousins. Now, by all accounts, Nicholas and Frances were very loving and caring parents, although Nicholas's mother Frances was so intense with this. She completely adored Kenneth and she doted on him almost too much, to the point where she was kind of suffocating him. Forensic psychiatrist Dr. Helen Morrison described in a documentary how Frances almost saw her son as this god. She worshipped the ground that he walked on, and she was absolutely terrified that something bad was going to happen to him all the time. She had this constant fear, this constant anxiety that he was going to become ill and die and that she would lose him. She would take him to the doctors all the time because she had convinced herself that he was sick and that he needed medical attention. But 9 times out of 10, he was fine. This was just her health anxiety. Frances was just so overprotective of Kenneth. She smothered him constantly. When he was very young, it was noticed by a lot of people around him that Kenneth liked to lie a lot. Pretty much as soon as he learned to talk, he learned to lie. He was a compulsive liar. He would lie about everything. When he was around 6 years old, he and his mother went to a supermarket, and when they got home, Frances noticed that he had stolen things from the supermarket. Just little things like sweets and stuff. He had put them in his pocket, and so Frances pulled him up on it and she said to him, "Kenneth, where did you get that stuff? Did you steal it from the shop?" But he lied. He denied it. He actually claimed that he had no idea how the sweets had gotten in his pocket. He refused to admit that he had taken them. So from a very, very young age, he's already starting to kind of experiment with committing crimes. He's stealing, and when he's pulled up on it and caught out, he lies. It was like he lost the capability to be honest, because lying was just second nature to him now. He had become very good at it. He was actually a very smart child, Kenneth Bianchi. He had a very high IQ, so he was incredibly intelligent, but he was also known to be very aggressive from a young age. He would often have angry and violent outbursts, and he was diagnosed with having passive-aggressive personality disorder. In 1964, when Kenneth was in his early teenage years, his father Nicholas passed away from pneumonia, which meant that it was now just Kenneth and his mum Frances living in the home. In 1970, Kenneth graduated from the Gates Chili High School, and just the year after, he married a girl named Brenda Beck, who was his high school sweetheart. However, Bianchi did not treat his new wife very well at all. He was incredibly controlling, and ironically, he always used to accuse her of being a liar. He apparently accused her of lying when it came to her job. She worked as a nurse. He accused her of cheating on him and lying about it, and so the marriage did not last very long. Just months later, they got a divorce. It was around this time in the early 70s that Bianchi became a student at the Monroe Community College, and he began studying psychology and also police science because he had decided that he wanted to work in the police force. He wanted to be a police officer, although he wasn't really willing to put in the work because he quit. He dropped out of college shortly after starting, but regardless, he still applied for jobs in the police force. However, he was rejected. Quite a few times he was rejected. So after this setback, he got a job working as a security guard at a jewelry store, but he was sacked from this job when his employers realized that he was stealing from the business. And it was following this when in 1976, Kenneth Bianchi's mother Frances decided that her son should go and stay with his cousin in Los Angeles, Angelo Buono. Frances and her sister Jenny, so Angelo's mother, decided that it might be beneficial for Kenneth to stay with Angelo for a while because, you know, Angelo was a lot older, so he could maybe be that kind of male authoritative figure that Kenneth hadn't had in a long time because his father passed away when he was a young boy. Maybe they thought that Angelo would help get Kenneth on the straight and narrow because by this point Angelo was earning a good living, he had a good business, etc. So that brings us to where we were before, in January of 1976. 1976, a 25-year-old Kenneth Bianchi packed up his things and he moved from Rochester in New York to LA in California. After arriving in LA, Kenneth applied for a job within the LAPD. He once again decided to try and get his dream job as a police officer, but he couldn't. He was once again rejected because he didn't have the qualifications. And so Kenneth Bianchi decided to do what he did best. He decided to try and lie his way into getting a job that he wanted. He created these fake certificates which stated that he had a psychiatry degree, and using it, he applied for a job with a psychologist in LA. And unbelievably, it worked. He was successful. He got the job and he was working with different patients with psychological problems, even though he wasn't qualified. Although I'm unsure how long he was actually in this job for. And in the summer of 1976, he finally joined the LAPD. He joined the LAPD Reserves Program. Now, this is where people can join the force as an unpaid volunteer just because they want to help serve the community. So Bianchi wasn't being paid for this, but I don't think he necessarily cared that much. He was just happy to finally be a part of the force in some way. Alongside this, he got another job, I think working in an office or some kind of desk job, so that he had money coming in. And it was whilst he was working in this job that he started dating one of his colleagues. Her name was Kelly, and eventually Bianchi moved out of his cousin's home and in with her, in with Kelly. But he still remained in regular contact with Angelo Buono. They'd actually become pretty close by this point. Bianchi really looked up to his older cousin. They became so close, in fact, that they decided they were going to go into business together to make some extra money. You see, Angelo Buono put forward an idea to Bianchi. He said that they should set up an agency for sex workers. They were going to be pimps, essentially. They were going to find young girls that they could employ as sex workers. They would advertise them to other men and then take a percentage of the money that they earn. And because Kenneth Bianchi admired his cousin so much, he agreed. He thought it was a great idea. And it wasn't long before they found two women to enlist. Their names were Sabra Hannon and Becky Spears. The two men began selling Sabra and Becky to other men for sex. However, this situation that they had going on went way beyond pimping the girls out. Buono and Bianchi essentially kept these girls as prisoners. They kept Sabra and Becky locked up in Buono's house. They would only be let out to meet with clients that the men had found. They were raped repeatedly by the cousins. They were threatened, physically abused by them, beaten. I cannot imagine the sheer terror that they must have experienced. Thankfully, both Sabra and Becky managed to escape Buono and Bianchi. They got out of Buono's house and they got away from them. They escaped these sadistic men with their lives, but sadly other women and girls would not be so lucky. Buono and Bianchi didn't stop their twisted behaviour after Sabra and Becky. They continued to target other women. They actually started going out at night. They would drive around the streets of LA in Buono's car looking for young women that they could rape together. And again, Angelo Buono came up with a suggestion, an idea of something that the pair could use in order to make it easier for them to pick up these women. Now, if you remember from earlier on in the video, we talked about how when Buono was a teenager, he idolized serial rapist Carol Chessman. And Chessman had a certain tactic that he would use when it came to attacking his victims. He actually used to flash a red light at motorists as they were driving past, a red light that resembled the kind of lights that police officers had on their cars at the time. So thinking that Chessman was a police officer, these motorists would pull over, and once they did, Chessman would firstly rob them and then he would force the women that he had stopped to perform sexual acts on him and he would rape them. And Angelo Buono was inspired by this. He wanted to kind of use Chessman's tactic in the rapes that he was committing with Bianchi, and so he came up with a plan. He said to Bianchi that they should use a security badge that Buono's stepfather owned to pretend that they were undercover police officers. That way they could essentially kidnap women on the streets. They could fake arrest them, and then the women wouldn't be seen putting up a fight, because most people wouldn't resist if they were stopped by a policeman. They would just go with them quietly. So that is exactly what they began doing. Buono and Bianchi would drive around the streets and they would approach sex workers and basically tell them that they were under arrest. They would then put them in the car and rape them, and then they would threaten the women and tell them that they would be in trouble with the police if they told anyone about what had happened. They loved the fact that they could essentially get free sex from these sex workers. They didn't have to pay for it. They could just pretend to be the police and rape them. This was exciting for the two men. However, eventually over time, this got boring for them. They had done it so much that it wasn't thrilling enough anymore. They didn't want to stop doing it. They didn't want to stop assaulting these women. They just wanted to make it more interesting. They wanted to up the stakes. The next woman that they attacked, they didn't want to only rape, they wanted to murder her as well. Buono expressed to Bianchi that he had a dark sexual fantasy in which he strangled a woman to death whilst he had an orgasm. And Bianchi basically said, let's do it. Just like everything else he had agreed to. He was willing to do anything that Buono wanted to do. Just like Harold Chessman was Buono's idol, Buono was Bianchi's. So late in the evening of the 17th of October 1977, Buono and Bianchi were once again prowling the streets looking for a potential victim. This time obviously with the intention of raping and killing her. They were driving along Sunset Boulevard in LA when they came across a 19-year-old girl named Yolanda Washington. She was a mother of one. She had a baby boy who was just 3 years old at the time, and I believe she was a single mother, so she had been working as a sex worker to try and support her and her child. And that is what she had been doing that night. Yolanda was working. She was waiting on Sunset Boulevard for a client to come along. But Kenneth Bianchi and Angelo Buono did. They approached Yolanda, they flashed their security badge pretending that it was a police badge, and they said that Yolanda needed to come with them, and so she did. They put her in the back of Kenneth Bianchi's car, which actually did look quite like a police car. Apparently he had a sedan car which was dark blue and white, so Yolanda probably wouldn't have thought even for a second that they weren't real police officers. That was until she was actually inside of the car and they drove away, because as Angelo Buono drove, Kenneth Bianchi raped and strangled her to death in the back of the vehicle. These evil cousins had just claimed their first murder victim. Following Yolanda's death, they drove her body to an area called Forest Lawn Drive in California, and there they just dumped her on a hillside by the side of a road and they left the scene. Her naked body was found early the next morning on the 18th of October 1977, and the police were called to the scene. And Buono and Bianchi quickly decided that they didn't want to stop there. They had enjoyed doing that to Yolanda so much that they wanted to do it again. And just 2 weeks later, they did. On the evening of the 30th of October 1977, the men once again took to the street of Sunset Boulevard in search for their second victim. And as they were driving around, they came across Judy Miller, who was just 15 years old at the time that this case took place. Judy was a student at the Hollywood High School. However, sources state that she was a runaway and that she often turned to sex work to make some money, even though she was so young. She was just a child, which of course in a way also meant that she was easily influenced. She was so vulnerable. So for Kenneth and Angelo, she was the perfect person to target. Once they spotted Judy, they approached her and offered to pay her for sex, and she accepted. So So she followed them to their car, and as soon as she was inside, as soon as she was trapped in the vehicle, they got out the fake police badges and they threatened her. However, this time they didn't kill Judy in the car like they had done with Yolanda. They decided to actually take her to Buono's auto upholstery shop. There she was bound, she was tied up, she was violently assaulted and raped before eventually she was strangled to death with a ligature. And then, just like with Yolanda, after Judy was dead, the killers dumped her naked body. Judy was found on the morning of the 1st of November 1977, lying face up on the ground on a street in La Crescenta, which is a neighborhood in LA. And apparently, according to sources, the person who found Judy that morning actually covered her nude body with a tarpaulin sheet whilst they waited for the police to arrive, because they didn't want the children who were on their way to school that morning to have to see that. When police arrived, they knew instantly that Judy had been murdered. It was obvious from just looking at her body. They could see marks on her body from where she had been bound. They obviously saw the ligature mark. Scientists also retrieved a fibre on Judy Miller's eyelid, which suggested that she had been blindfolded during the attack. But what the police didn't see on Judy's body were any kind of drag marks, which they would have expected to see, assuming that the killer would have had to drag her along the ground to the spot where she was found, unless, of course, there were two killers and she was carried. So now the police had two murders to investigate. Two young women had been brutally raped and murdered within just a fortnight, and it wouldn't be long before they had a third very similar murder on their hands. Just a couple of days after Judy Miller was found dead, her killers struck again. On the 5th of November, a woman named Lisa Castin was walking alone to her apartment when she caught the eye of Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi. Lisa was 21 years old. She worked as a waitress at a restaurant, but she was also a part of a dance group called the LA Knockers. She was a professional dancer. And what's interesting about this case is that Lisa was not a sex worker like Yolanda and Judy and all of the women before them that the men had raped. Before Lisa, they seemed to only target sex workers. It's believed because, well, number one, I guess it was easier to fake arrest them because they were involved in sex work, which was illegal. And number two, because Buono and Bianchi held the belief that sex workers were worthless and that no one would miss them. No one would probably even notice if they went missing, which is just vile. But of course, Lisa wasn't a sex worker, and I imagine they probably decided to switch it up to again make it more exciting for them. Anyway, on the evening of the 5th of November, Lisa finished her shift at the restaurant where she worked, and as she was walking home, she was targeted by Bianchi and Buono. Just like with the first two victims, they lied to Lisa and said that they were police officers. They showed her the fake badge and they said that they needed to take her to the police station to interview her about something. But of course, they never took her to a police station. They abducted her and took her to the upholstery shop where she was subjected to a horrific attack. She was bound, raped by the two men, and then strangled to death. And then just the next day, Lisa's dead body was discovered dumped in some bushes in an area in Glendale in California. And when the police arrived at the scene, they noticed that she had very similar injuries as Judy Miller. She had ligature marks on her neck from the strangulation, and she had marks on her wrists and on her ankles from where she had been tied up. Now, it's believed that around this same time in early November of 1977, the killers tried to abduct another young woman. However, they failed. While I say they failed, they actually aborted the plan when they realized who the young woman was. Her name was Catherine Law. She was about about 24 years old at the time, and her father was famous actor Peter Law. Peter had been in a number of different films, including Casablanca and Casino Royale. He was very well known around this time in the 70s. Anyway, one evening in November of 1977, his daughter Catherine was approached by Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi as they were out looking for their next murder victim. And clearly they decided that that was going to be Catherine. They approached her with their fake police badges. They planned to abduct and kill her, until at least they looked at a picture that Catherine had in her possession. It was a photo of her with her father, Peter Moore. And when Angelo and Kenneth looked at Catherine's ID and they saw her name, they realised who she was. They realised that she was the daughter of a famous actor. And it's believed that as soon as they realised that, they decided just to not go through with it, not to kill Catherine, because they were worried that the murder of a famous person's child would attract a lot more attention. And of course, the more attention, the higher the risk to them, the more chance they had of being caught. And so they just cancelled the plan. They left Catherine alone. And it wasn't until Buono and Bianchi were later caught when she realised that it was them that approached her that night. She had escaped 2 serial killers, and at the time she didn't even know it. The 4th murder victim of Buono and Bianchi was Jane King. She was 28 years old and she was a model and aspiring actress. Jane disappeared on the 9th of November 1977 after she was approached by Kenneth and Angelo while she was at a bus stop in Hollywood. We can assume that they used the same tactic with Jane as they did with the previous victims. They flashed their police badges. They told her that she had to come with them, and then they took her to Buono's shop where she suffered the same fate as the rest of the victims. She was raped by the 2 men, she was strangled to death, and then they took her body and dumped her in some bushes next to the Golden State Freeway. Now, Jane's body wasn't actually found for a while. She wasn't found until the 23rd of November, about 2 weeks after she went missing. And by that time, 3 more victims of Buono and Bianchi had been found. So even though Jane was technically the 4th murder victim, she was the 7th to be found. And that just shows you how quickly these killers were operating. This really was a serial killing spree. They had abducted and murdered 7 people within a matter of weeks. They didn't really have like a cooling off period in between each one. It was just kill after kill after kill. Just a couple of days after the murder of Jane King, on the 13th of November, Buono and Bianchi were once again out on the streets searching for their next target, and that was when they came across 2 young girls, Sonia Johnson and Dolores Capida, who were just 12 and 14 years old. Sonia was 14 and Dolores was 12. The 2 young girls had been out shopping together that afternoon, and then after their shopping trip, they got on a bus to go back home. They got off the bus at York Boulevard and North Avenue 46, and pretty much as soon as they did, they were stopped by 2 men who, of course, they thought were police officers. When Buono and Bianchi told Dolores and Sonia to get into their car, they didn't hesitate for a second. They were 2 vulnerable young girls, 2 children. They were going to do whatever these men told them to do because they didn't want to get into trouble. So they got in the car and then they were taken back to Buono's shop where they were tied up, gagged, and actually held captive. Buono and Bianchi didn't kill the girls straight away. They were kept alive for 5 days. 5 days and held as prisoners. I mean, it's just inconceivable, isn't it, to imagine what those girls went through in that time, the intense fear that they must have felt. During their captivity, both girls were raped repeatedly by both men until eventually they were strangled to death. Following their deaths, the killers dumped their bodies on a hillside in a trash dump above the Interstate 5 freeway near the LA Dodgers Stadium. Their bodies were discovered on the 20th of November 1977 1977, a week after they went missing, and they were found by a couple of children who initially thought that they were mannequins when they first saw them. However, they quickly realized that that wasn't the case. These weren't mannequins, these were real dead bodies, and so the police were called to the scene. Buono and Bianchi would claim their 7th victim just days after the murders of Sonia and Dolores. Victim number 7 was Christina Weckler. She was 20 years old and she was an honors student at the Arts Center College of Design in California, where she obviously studied art. Now, unlike previous victims, Christina wasn't actually a stranger to the people who would go on to be her killers. Well, I believe she was to Buono, but not Bianchi. She knew Kenneth Bianchi because they actually lived pretty close to one another. They were neighbours. They lived on the same street. She lived in an apartment on East Garfield Avenue in Glendale, so they knew of each other and she probably would have trusted him. So when Bianchi knocked on her door in November of 1977, claiming that he was now a police officer and that she had to come with him because there had been an incident involving her car, she believed him and off she went. Of course, this was all just a lie. Her car was fine. Kenneth wasn't a police officer, but by the time Christina realized, it was too late. She was kidnapped and taken to Angelo Buono's home. Her wrists were tied together, her ankles were tied together, and Christina also wasn't killed straight away. Sickeningly, before killing her, Buono and Bianchi decided that they wanted to conduct some experiments on Christina. They wanted to torture her. As part of this torture, they put a plastic bag over her head, and then they put a gas pipe into it. They obviously wanted her to breathe in the toxic fumes and suffocate. But as well as that, the men got some cleaning products and they literally injected Christina with these chemicals. They injected her arms and her neck just because they wanted to see what would happen. Following Christina's death, her body was left on a hillside in Highland Park, and I believe she was actually found on the same day as Sonia Johnson and Dolores Capida, the 20th of November 1977. So on the same day, 3 murder victims were discovered, making the total now 7. When Christina was found, it was noted that she had the same ligature marks as the previous victim. She had marks on her wrists, on her ankles, on her neck. But again, there were no drag marks on her body, indicating that she had been carried to the location where she was found. And I think it was at this point when the police really started to connect the dots. They really started to realise that they had a serial killer on their hands, but not just one, 2. They were confident that the absence of drag marks on the victims' bodies probably meant that there were 2 people involved here. There wasn't just one perpetrator. This was a killing duo. Now, when the police started their investigation into Christina's murder, Kenneth Bianchi was a name that they came across. I believe partly because they were neighbours, but also because apparently Christina had written Kenneth's name down in one of her notebooks, and alongside it she described him as being like a quote used car salesman. And I think what she meant by that was that Kenneth was someone that could really sell himself. He had that kind of charisma. That was something that a lot of people said about Kenneth Bianchi. Actually, he was a very charming man. He could charm anyone. He could talk anyone into anything, and it's believed that that was kind of his main role in the murders. He was the one that would convince their victims to get in the car with him. He was able to come across as this friendly, charismatic guy so that people didn't feel uneasy or unsafe in his presence. Whereas Angelo Buono didn't really have that. He didn't have that kind of personality. So they really needed Bianchi in order to successfully carry out these killings. But anyway, as I was saying, Kenneth Bianchi's name did come up whilst the police were looking into Christina's murder. However, the police had so many other leads and lines of inquiry to look into as well, and I guess at the time they didn't pay enough attention to this name as they maybe should have, because they were just completely sidetracked with everything else. So once again, Buono and Bianchi were able to fly under the radar. They were free to kill again. However, by this point, there were a lot of police officers in uniform posted around the northeast area of LA, where I think most of the victims so far had been abducted from, where they were last seen. Detectives recognized that pattern, and so they had police officers out on the streets in this area as kind of like security. And when Buono and Bianchi realized this, they decided that they needed to look for their next victim further afield. They abducted their 8th victim from an area in San Fernando Valley in California, over 20 miles away. Her name was Lauren Wagner. She was an 18-year-old college student studying business who lived with her parents. On the night of the 28th of November 1977, Lauren was in her car. She was driving home and she was completely unaware of the fact that she was being followed by 2 serial killers. Bianchi and Buono had been driving around the area that evening looking for another young woman that they could kidnap, and when they spotted Lauren, they followed her car all the way back to her home. Lauren parked her car on a street very close to her house. It was just opposite, and I think before she even had a chance to get out of her car, Bianchi and Buono were there. They were at her car window. As usual, they told her that they were police officers and that she had to get in their car and come with them. But Lauren was very hesitant, which I don't think Buono and Bianchi were really used to. Normally their victims would trust them and just go with them without a second thought. But Lauren didn't. She seemed quite apprehensive to start with, and she kind of resisted initially. But unfortunately, eventually they did manage to get her into the vehicle. Once she was trapped inside, they headed straight to Angelo Buono's home. There, Lauren was gagged, she was bound, she was tied to a chair in his living room in his house, and they tortured her. They actually stuck electrical wires to Lauren's hands and then they plugged them into the wall so that the wires would electrocute her. She was also raped by the 2 men before being strangled to death, and her naked body was dumped on a hillside. When she was found the next day, the police once again noticed the same ligature marks on her body that they had noticed on previous victims. They also noticed injuries on the palm of her hand. She had burn marks on her hands from where she had been electrocuted. In addition to that, a fibre was picked up from Lauren's body. It was found stuck on one of her hands from where her killers had used tape to tie her up and also stick the electrical wires to her. The adhesive from the tape had meant that the fibre had stuck, so the fibre was collected as evidence. And what's absolutely heartbreaking about this case is that before the police could even get to Lauren's family to deliver the news, the media had beaten them to it. By this point, pretty much the whole of LA knew that the police were looking for a serial killer, so the news of an 8th victim being found spread like wildfire. It was very quickly all over the news, and Lauren's parents heard about her death when journalists turned up at their door desperate to interview them about their daughter's murder, which is just so awful. Now, when the murder investigation was launched into Lauren Wagner's murder, it wasn't actually long before the police received a lead, a pretty big lead actually. One of Lauren's neighbours came forward saying that they saw something on the night that she disappeared, the 28th of November. They actually witnessed Lauren's abduction. This neighbour said that she saw Lauren being put into a car by 2 men. And apparently this neighbour said that it looked like Lauren was being arrested. It looked like these 2 men were police officers putting her in the back of a police car. So this pretty much confirmed the police's theory that there were 2 people people responsible for these murders, 2 killers, were working together. It was also around this same time, after Lauren's body was found, that the media had given these unidentified killers a name, and that name, of course, was the Hillside Stranglers, because obviously most of the victims were discovered dumped on hillsides, and because their cause of death was strangulation. And as I'm sure you would expect, everyone was absolutely terrified, because it didn't really seem as though the police were any closer to catching the perpetrators, and it was clear to everyone that these were killers that were not going to stop. They were not going to stop their murder spree until they were caught. So how many more lives were going to be taken before that happened? Young women in particular were especially terrified, of course, because clearly they were the ones who were being targeted. So women were frantically taking lessons in self-defense classes, karate classes. They were going out and buying weapons like guns. I truly can imagine how scary it must have been to be a young woman in that area at the time, knowing that there was a chance that you could be next. You could be the next victim of the Hillside Strangler. And what was even more terrifying for these women was that they no longer knew who they could trust. As I said a minute ago, the neighbor who witnessed Lauren Wagner's abduction said that it looked as though the men who took her were police officers. They were pretending to be policemen. So when this news broke, women were scared of the police, the very people who were supposed to protect them. They didn't know what to do now if they were ever stopped by a police officer. Should they resist arrest or just go with them willingly? They didn't know what to do because they couldn't trust that none of the officers were the Hillside Stranglers. So of course this meant that there was even more pressure on the police to catch the killers, and quickly. And so a task force of 100 police officers was set up to hunt them down and identify them. But sadly there would be even more murder victims before that day came. In mid-December of 1977, Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi decided that they were ready to kill again. However, because of all of the media and the news coverage that this case was receiving, and because of all the police officers out patrolling the streets, they were very aware that there was now an extremely high risk of getting caught should they go out and do their usual routine of driving around LA looking for victims. And so instead of going out and searching for a victim themselves, they decided that they were going to try and get their 9th victim to come to them. Now, Kenneth Bianchi lived in an apartment block, and around this time he knew that one of the apartments close to his was empty. There was no one living in it. And so he suggested to Buono that they should break into this vacant apartment. They should call a sex worker agency pretending to be a customer and request for a sex worker to come to their address. And then when the sex worker they send shows up, they can murder her there in that empty apartment. And because the apartment was empty, the police probably wouldn't be able to trace the person that called the sex worker there. And so that's exactly what Buono and Bianchi did on the 13th of December 1977. They made the call and they waited inside the apartment. A young girl named Kimberly Martin turned up. She was just 17 years old, and she hadn't actually been working for the sex worker agency for very long. She used to, I think, just work alone on the streets. She would wait on the streets for clients to approach her. The only reason that she switched to working for an agency was because she was so scared of being out on the streets at night, because she knew that there was a serial killer on the loose. Little did she know that those serial killers were inside of that apartment that she had just been called to. Literally, as soon as Kimberly arrived, she was attacked by the 2 men, and she tried desperately hard to fight back. She was really fighting for her life. She was doing everything that she could to try and get out of that apartment. And in doing so, she actually suffered a really bad head injury, where it's believed there was a violent struggle between her and the killers, stranglers and they hit her head against a wall. Once they had Kimberly under control, she was probably knocked out by this point, they took her to Buono's upholstery shop where she suffered the same fate as previous victims. She was raped and strangled to death. Kimberly was found the next day on the 14th of December 1977. She was discovered naked on a hillside, just like many of the other victims. However, this time Buono and Bianchi took great care in how they left her. Kimberly had been posed. I think her legs were kind of straight and her arms were spread out to the side, almost like Jesus on the cross. And the hill that she was left on was a hill that was overlooking downtown Los Angeles, so many people would have seen her body. And Buono and Bianchi obviously wanted that. It was like they were sending a message to the police and the public. A message like, we've been dubbed the Hillside Stranglers and that's exactly what we are and you'll never be able to catch us. It was like they were laughing at the police. They were loving this. Kenneth Bianchi in particular was loving it because he was actually still a volunteer of the LAPD reserves, and I have no doubt that he would have revelled in the fact that throughout his and Buono's killing spree, he was still actively involved in the police, and all of his fellow LAPD volunteers had absolutely no idea that he was the one committing these heinous crimes. In fact, throughout the murders, he was going on ride-alongs with the police, he was going out on patrol, and just a couple of days after Kimberly Martin was killed, he volunteered to go out on patrol with the local sergeant. And during this, he kept asking the sergeant a load of questions about Kimberly's murder and I think just the Hillside Strangler case in general, probably because he wanted to know exactly what the police knew. He wanted to kind of gauge whether or not they were any closer to identifying the murderers, identifying him. The 10th and final murder that Buono and Bianchi committed as a duo wouldn't come until February of 1978, a couple of months after Kimberly was killed, which was pretty unusual for them. All of their murders so far had been in very, very quick succession. They committed 9 murders within about 2 months, but it's believed that they decided to just take a little break for a short while just to kind of stay under the radar and lay low. I also read on one source that Angelo Buono's mother died in January of 1978, so I wonder if maybe that might have had something to do with why they stopped for a bit. But in February of 1978, their killing spree would resume. It was the 16th of February 1978 when 20-year-old Cindy Lee Hutsworth became their 10th victim. At the time, Cindy was a student at college and she was also working as a waitress part-time, according to a few sources. On that fateful day, Cindy went into Angelo Buono's auto upholstery shop because she wanted him to do some work on her car. And literally as soon as Buono saw her, he knew that he wanted her to be their next kill. And when Kenneth Bianchi arrived at the shop shortly after, he agreed. So Cindy was taken hostage, she was tied up, she was raped, tortured, and then she was strangled to death. Now, because Cindy obviously had her car with her at the shop, the two killers decided that instead of transporting her body in one of their cars, they were going to use hers. They put her body in the trunk of her vehicle and then they drove to a cliff by the Los Angeles Crest Highway. Once they arrived, they got out of the car and they pushed it down the cliff with Cindy's naked body still in the trunk. And just the next day, the car was found. Cindy was found, and the police knew that she was another victim of the Hillside Stranglers because she had sustained the same injuries as the others. She had been raped, her cause of death was strangulation, she had all the same ligature marks from where she had been tied up. But something really bizarre happened after the murder of Cindy Lee Hutsworth. The killings seemed to just stop, and not just for a week or a few weeks or a few months like that last gap. This time they seemed to stop for good, which just completely baffled the police. However, there was a reason for this. There was a reason why Buono and Bianchi just stopped all of a sudden, and that reason was that they had had a huge argument. As I touched on previously, the younger of the two cousins, Kenneth Bianchi, he in particular absolutely loved the attention that these murders were getting. He loved the fact that everyone knew about the Hillside Stranglers, to the point where he would even brag to people about the murders, and he would say things like, oh, I could be the Hillside Strangler, you know. As we know, he was also going out on patrol and on ride-alongs with the police, and he was asking them a load of questions about the murder investigation. He was playing a very risky game, but he kind of didn't care. He was arrogant and he clearly felt invincible. However, when his killing partner Angelo Buono found out about what Bianchi had been doing, bragging about the murders to people, asking the police questions, he was absolutely furious with his cousin. He was so angry that Bianchi had been so careless. He was putting them at risk of being caught. He was so angry, in fact, that Buono told Bianchi that he didn't want anything to do with him anymore. He didn't want to ever see him again. And so that was that. That was the end of their relationship. That was the end of their killing spree as a duo. It ended with Cindy Lee Hudspeth. Around this same time, actually very shortly after Cindy Lee Hudspeth was killed in February of 1978, 27-year-old Kenneth Bianchi became a father. He and his girlfriend at the time, Kelly, had a child together. They had a son named Sean. And surprisingly, despite how evil this man was, he fell completely in love with his son. He doted on this little boy. So he was absolutely heartbroken when just a couple of months after he was born, in May of 1978, his son was taken away from him. You see, that was when his girlfriend Kelly broke up with him. She decided that she didn't want to be with Kenneth anymore, so she ended the relationship and she moved with their son all the way to Bellingham, which is a city in the state of Washington. And Kenneth didn't want to be without his son, so he moved with them. He followed them to Washington. He got a job there. He started working as a security guard. He had a whole new life, and by all accounts, he liked it. He liked his new life in Washington. But there was one thing about his old life that he missed so much, and that was killing. Committing murders had become like an addiction to Kenneth Bianchi now, and so even though he was no longer in contact with his old killing partner Angelo Buono, he decided that he was going to kill again, but this time, of course, he would be alone. Just 8 months after he moved to Washington, in January of 1979, Kenneth Bianchi devised a plan to carry out a double murder. 22-year-old Karen Mandick and 27-year-old Diane Wilder were two students from Western Washington University, and they actually lived together. They were roommates, and as they were uni students, I imagine they were eager to make some extra money, and so they jumped at an opportunity that was presented to them by Kenneth Bianchi. One day, he offered to pay them $100 to basically house sit, this property that he was guarding as a security guard, and they accepted, of course, completely unaware of his true intentions. On the 11th of January 1979, Karen and Diane arrived at this house and they were greeted by Kenneth Bianchi. Once inside, Bianchi somehow got the two young women down into the basement of the property, and in that basement, he murdered them both. He put a ligature around their necks and he strangled them both to death. I'm unsure whether or not he raped them. Some sources say that he did, whereas a documentary that I watched stated that he masturbated over one of their bodies. But following their deaths, he put both Karen and Diane into the trunk of Karen's car. He then drove the car to an area next to a hillside in Washington, and he left it there. And the girls' bodies were found on the 12th of January, just the day after they were murdered. And so a double murder investigation was launched by the police. And this time, Kenneth Bianchi wasn't very good at covering his tracks, probably because he didn't have Angelo Buono. Angelo Buono was always really the brain behind the whole thing, and because he didn't have Buono now, Bianchi didn't foresee the connection that the police could find between him and the victims, Karen and Diane. After looking into Karen and Diane's movements in the lead up to their murders and speaking to their friends and family, they learned from Karen's boyfriend about the house-sitting job that she and Diane had taken on. She even told her boyfriend the name of the security guard who had gotten them this house-sitting job: Kenny Bianchi. After searching Karen and Diane's apartment, the police also found a piece of paper on which Diane had written Kenneth Bianchi's name. And next to it, she wrote something like Kenneth had recently phoned them and that they needed to call him back. So after finding out all of this and connecting the dots, Kenneth Bianchi was arrested. Now, when the police searched Kenneth's apartment, they apparently found a load of things that he had stolen. They found stolen goods. So luckily that meant that they were going to be able to hold him in custody for that whilst they carried on investigating these double murders that they now suspected him of committing. Now, after looking into Bianchi a bit more, the Bellingham police discovered something very interesting. He had a Californian driving license, and so realizing that that was where he was previously from, LA in California, the Bellingham police got in contact with the LAPD. I think just to find out if they knew of Kenneth Bianchi, if maybe he had been involved in any kind of violent crime back when he lived in California. And when the LAPD took a look at Bianchi's license, they also noticed something. They noticed his address from when he lived in LA, and they realized that Kenneth Bianchi used to live on the exact same street that Christina Weckler lived on, one of the Hillside Strangler victims. He lived there at the same time that Christina was abducted and killed, and immediately the police thought that this was suspicious. They began thinking, hold on, maybe this is a potential lead that we perhaps missed in the original investigation that we didn't look enough into. They thought, surely it can't just be coincidental that this man, Kenneth Bianchi, who is currently the main suspect in the murders of two young women in Washington, also just happened to live on the same street as another young woman who was murdered in LA less than 2 years prior. The LAPD began thinking, what if Kenneth Bianchi was the man that they had been looking for? What if he was the person responsible for the Hillside Strangler murders? I mean, the timeline matched up. The police soon learned that the Hillside murders stopped not long before he moved away to Washington. So Bianchi was interviewed about the murders that the police suspected he had committed, and I think initially he tried to deny it, but eventually he kind of gave up the denial, and he basically claimed that he had multiple personality disorder. He had two personalities. One of them was Kenneth Bianchi, and the other was named Steve Walker. Steve was his alter ego, and he claimed that he, Kenneth, wasn't responsible for the murders, but that Steve was. He also later said that he had a third personality as well, named Billy, although coincidentally this was after he was informed that people with multiple personality disorders usually have more than just two. So then he suddenly added Billy, but he stuck to the story that Steve was the bad guy, he was the killer. However, the investigators did not really believe this for 1 minute. They did not believe that Kenneth had multiple personality disorder. They believed that he was faking it in the hopes that he would be deemed too mentally unstable to be held responsible for his actions. So detectives decided to bring in one of the best criminal psychiatrists in the US, Dr. Martin Orne, to test this to see if he thought Bianchi really did have multiple personalities. And after extensively examining Bianchi and interviewing him multiple times, he concluded that Bianchi was faking it. He strongly believed that he was lying about this Steve Walker. From what I can gather, despite this, Bianchi still decided to plead not guilty to his charges by reason of insanity, which meant that the case would have to go to trial. Although when investigators said that they would seek the death penalty for him should he be convicted, he panicked and he said that he wanted to make a deal with them. And this was when Kenneth Bianchi told the police about his cousin, Angelo Buono, the second half of the Hillside Strangler duo. He told the police that he and Buono committed the 10 Hillside Strangler murders together. And he made a deal with the investigators that he would plead guilty to his charges and he would tell them everything. He would even give evidence against Buono as long as he didn't get the death penalty. He was terrified of getting the death penalty, and so both parties agreed to this deal. Bianchi agreed and investigators agreed. So Bianchi sat down with the detectives and he told them everything, how and when the murders started, how they would find their victims, all of the details about the killings that he could remember, absolutely everything. In October of 1979, Angelo Buono was arrested. At this point, he was around 44, 45 years old, and he denied everything. He said that he was innocent, that Kenneth was a liar, and that he had absolutely nothing to do with any of the murders. So the police got to work on trying to find evidence that linked him to the crimes. Yes, they had the statements from Kenneth Bianchi, but they couldn't just rely on that. They knew that they couldn't convict him on just that. They needed more. So they searched his home in LA and also his auto upholstery shop, his workshop, where Bianchi told them the murders had taken place. However, the police really struggled to find anything. They searched for any fingerprints that may have been left behind by any of the victims, but they didn't find any. And the reason for this was because Angelo Buono would actually meticulously clean both his house and his shop, I believe after every single murder. He was actually just a very clean person in general. He was cleaning all of the time, so any fingerprints would have just been washed away. And obviously back then in the late 70s, the police didn't have the use of DNA and forensic technology. The only thing that they could really look for was fingerprints, but there was none. But eventually they had a breakthrough. If you recall from earlier on in the video, we talked about how when the second victim, Judy Miller's body was found, authorities retrieved a fibre from her eyelid. It was a white polyester fibre. So at the time, it was collected and stored as potential evidence. And when Buono was identified and after tests were conducted, they discovered that this fibre on Judy's eyelid perfectly matched some upholstery material that Buono had in his shop, proving that Judy had been in his shop shortly before her dead body was found. This material was used to blindfold her. In addition to that, the police were able to connect Angelo Buono to another fibre that was found on victim number 8, Lauren Wagner's body. The fibre was found stuck to her hand and it matched a chair that Buono had in his living room. This was the chair that Buono and Bianchi would tie their victims down to. So that was solid evidence linking Buono to the case, and he was charged. As part of his deal, Kenneth Bianchi pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder. He pleaded guilty to the murders of Karen Mandic and Diane Wilder, which obviously happened in Washington, the 2 murders that he committed alone. And he also pleaded guilty to 5 of the Hillside Strangler murders. I'm not sure why he was charged with only 5. I'm guessing that just must have been agreed in his plea deal. Although something really bizarre that happened during this whole time whilst Bianchi and Buono were being prosecuted that I just had to mention was that Bianchi began a new relationship with a woman named Veronica Lynn Compton, and Veronica was completely obsessed with Kenneth Bianchi. She actually had just an obsession with serial killers in general, and she reached out to Bianchi whilst he was being held behind bars, and she sent him a copy of this screenplay that she had written about a female serial killer. The screenplay was called The Mutilated Cutter, and Veronica basically wanted Kenneth Bianchi's opinion on it as a serial killer himself. As they continued chatting, her obsession with Bianchi just grew and grew and grew, and they started a relationship. And during their relationship, Bianchi shared with Veronica a plan that he had come up with, a plan to get him out of prison, I guess so that they could be together properly. Bianchi said that Veronica should carry out a murder in LA that was pretty much identical to the Hillside Strangler murders, so that hopefully the police would think that they had the wrong guys, that the real killer was still out there, even though I'm pretty sure Bianchi had already confessed by this point. But anyway, he told Veronica about this plan, and unbelievably, she agreed. She agreed to do this for Kenneth. She was willing to do anything if it meant that he could be free. So one day, Veronica lured this young woman to a motel and she tried to kill her. She tried to strangle her to death, but thankfully this woman was able to fight back. She was able to overpower Veronica and she survived. Veronica was arrested, she was convicted of this crime, and she was sent to prison, although I'm not sure how long for. But anyway, as I was saying before that, Kenneth Bianchi pleaded guilty to 7 counts of murder, whereas Angelo Buono, on the other hand, continued to deny everything, and so he pleaded not guilty to all of his charges, which meant that his case would have to go to trial. According to sources, there were quite a few delays surrounding his trial, which meant that it didn't really properly begin until around the spring of 1982. During the trial, his cousin and killing partner, Kenneth Bianchi, testified against him as agreed in his plea deal. He gave evidence for the prosecution, although some sources state that it seemed as though Bianchi kept trying to sabotage the trial. He testified as a witness for about 6 months. This was a very, very long trial, and during his testimonies, he would constantly change his story. He just wasn't very cooperative at all. It almost seemed as though, despite being the one that implicated him, he wanted Buono to get away with this. Sabra Hannon was one of the many witnesses that was brought forward during the trial. If you recall, she was one of the 2 women that Bianchi and Buono pimped out for money before their killing spree began. She was raped repeatedly by both men. She was beaten. She was kept prisoner, but luckily she managed to escape them with her life. And she told her story during the trial. She told the court about how she was treated by the 2 men. At the end of the trial, in November of 1983, 49-year-old Angelo Buono was found guilty of 9 counts of murder. The only murder that he wasn't convicted of was the first one, the murder of Yolanda Washington, and the reason for that was because, if you recall, Kenneth Bianchi was the one who physically strangled Yolanda to death. Unlike the other victims, she was killed in the back seat of their car, and Angelo was driving the car whilst Kenneth killed Yolanda. So Buono wasn't convicted of her murder, but he was found guilty of all of the others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He was never to be freed. After he was convicted, he was sent to Calipatria State Prison in California to serve his sentence. However, in 2002, at the age of 67, Angelo Buono passed away after suffering a heart attack. Kenneth Bianchi, on the other hand, he was also sentenced to life in prison. However, his plea deal meant that he would be eligible to apply for parole one day. However, it is now more than 40 years later and he is still behind bars. He apparently applied for parole in 2010, but he was denied. And according to one source, he won't be able to apply again until 2025. I do think, though, that it is highly, highly unlikely that he will ever be let out. I would be completely and utterly shocked if anyone authorized his release. case. Kenneth Bianchi is currently imprisoned at Washington State Penitentiary. He is still alive today. He is 71 years old. As you'll know if you watched my video on the Alphabet murders, Kenneth Bianchi was looked into as a potential suspect in that case. I covered that case just a couple of months ago in May. I'll leave it linked down below if you want to watch it. But in the early 1970s, 3 young girls disappeared from the streets of Rochester in New York and were later found murdered. And Kenneth Bianchi lived in Rochester at the time that these murders occurred. So years later, when he was identified as being the Hillside Strangler, the police in Rochester did look into the possibility that maybe he was the Alphabet killer too. However, he was eventually ruled out when his prints proved not to be a match to a palm print that was found on one of the victims' neck. And that is it for this case. That is the infamous case of the Hillside Stranglers, Angelo Buono and Kenneth Bianchi. A very, very heartbreaking case with so many victims, so many lives taken. So although their killing spree didn't actually last too long, it had such a huge and devastating impact, as I'm sure you can imagine. But yeah, that is it for this case. I feel like this video will be a very long one, so as always, let me know if you made it all the way to the end. Also, let me know your opinions on the case in the comments. I would love to hear what you guys think. You can also let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. I do have a case request form linked in the description box of all of my videos, so if you want to request a case, that is probably the best place to do so. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye!